You're listening to the Wired for Impact podcast.
Would you say that the banking crisis is the biggest financial threat facing the country right now, or is there something even bigger?
Right. There's actually something even bigger than the banking crisis, and that is the US national debt. The US national debt is the amount of money that they are printing in bonds or issuing in debt in order to finance the healthcare, welfare, roads, army, military, wars in the Middle East, wars
Interest
in Ukraine,
payments.
another war. Interest payments. So their interest payments alone have literally doubled, and they don't have the revenue coming in to maintain those interest payments on the bonds. Now, they're supposed to be issuing $2 trillion worth of bonds this year in 2024, but based on the acceleration of rising debt from September, it's going to be more like 3.6 trillion. So the US doesn't have the money to repay the loans. Doesn't have the money, does not have the money. So what they're going to be doing, they're going to be issuing more loans to pay back. You're a bit of a Madoff to pay back borrower A. So investor A wants his $10 million back. No problem. They're going to issue $10 million new debt, but the problem is they're issuing it at 4.5%, where the old debt was paying at 0.5%. So now they've got to pay interest at 4.5% to get the buyers, which is the banks and the investors, to buy into Uncle Sam's bonds. That's the problem. So that is the biggest crisis. That one is really being massaged over.
I mean, this is mathematically insolvent. There's no indication from my tiny perspective that there's any sort of leadership that's going to lead us to safer havens. I mean, it just looks like they're doubling down on everything. So you very poetically used the term massaging. Let's talk a little bit about some of the corruption, or at the very least, the manipulation, misdirection, misinformation that is happening in the markets today. What are some of the key indicators that we ought to be looking at, and why do you think those numbers are quote unquote massaged? One, for example, that I've heard you mention often on your channel is the employment numbers. Maybe you could start with that one.
If we start with that one, we ain't going to cover any other subjects, Peter, because that is a massive subject. That'll take a whole hour on its own. So if I get too boring, cut me out. Say, okay, no, enough. All right, because it's a really heavy subject. It's quite simple. There's two numbers in the economy you want to look at: employment. Now, I am naturally not a bear. I'm actually a bull. I believe in investment and driving and pushing business and manufacturing and building factories. And if the factory's employing 100 people, expand it, get more production going. However, the US, which seems to be unique, similar to a Soviet era style government, has this obsession with creating jobs. But the jobs it's creating are government jobs, healthcare, welfare jobs, and not many manufacturing jobs. In fact, if you were to travel around the States and speak to regular businessmen, not Amazon and not Tesla and not NVIDIA, talk to a regular businessman, he's actually laying off people. There's more people being laid off. But what they're doing is the people that are being laid off, they are getting a 6-month payout or 8-month payout or 12-month payout. Therefore, they are not considered unemployed. And they're still part of the labor force. Therefore, they're employed because they're getting a paycheck or they've been paid 12 months in advance. So that number is low. Employed numbers are high. But if you were to really assess who's out of a job, in other words, what's he doing when he gets up at 6 in the morning, or every time the viewers get up 7 in the morning, where's he going to? He's going to walk his dog. He's going to the golf course. So he's non-productive. Effectively, he's unemployed. He's laid off. He hasn't got a job to go to. That's unemployed, but they're ignoring those numbers because he's being paid a salary, a wage, or a paycheck, whatever the case may be. They're looking at the employed numbers and they say, right, okay, Peter, you've got a job as a podcaster. You are employed. And they say, hold on, I also work at McDonald's. Really? You've got 2 jobs then. That's 2 jobs being created. You're a podcaster and you're also a McDonald's delivery guy, or dishing out whatever they are in McDonald's, except I don't eat McDonald's, so whatever they dish out of McDonald's, you'll dish out of McDonald's. Therefore, you've got 2 jobs. So 1 person, 2 jobs. The numbers are misleading, and there's no way a developed economy like the US, with its rising unemployment with Google, and UPS and Intel and Citigroup and Amazon and Tesla have all laid off. Snap has just laid off 500 people. Tens of thousands. Facebook's laying off. Tens of thousands are disappearing because they get a paycheck for 12 months. They're not unemployed. So real unemployment is running at 7-8% if you were to take those numbers in, where the people have got nothing to do every day. Excuse me, if I get up in the morning, I've got nothing to do, I'm going to play tennis, for all intents and purposes, I'm unemployed. That's really how I see it. But they don't. They say, oh, you've got a little bit of investment income, you're employed. Don't worry about you. Let's focus on the McDonald's workers. So yes, it's all contrived.
What about inflation and those numbers?
Wow, that's a great one. Okay, so the Fed has been very lucky that inflation has come down not as a result of its policies. Interest rates have not impacted inflation. What's brought down inflation is the reduction in energy prices. Energy prices have fallen, therefore, and the supply chains increased, and the goods have become more available. But it's not the Fed policy of rising interest rates. If you look at retail spending, interest rates haven't really impacted people's spending habits. They're still spending as if it's the last chance saloon down in Ohio, and they're going to spend the last penny before everything just combusts. What's interesting is that credit card defaults and delinquencies, which I mentioned today and yesterday on my Instagram, have surged. I use the word surged because no one's going to give an exact number. It's probably about 50% higher. But let's say they use the word surged, which is what's been used by CNBC and all of the financial channels. So what you've got is inflation is bubbling up. So I called the bottom of inflation in July this year. I said it's bottomed out and it's probably going to rise up. Remember, there's three types of inflation. You've got producer price index at the manufacturing level. You've got retail price inflation, which is consumer price index at what you and I spend on a box of cornflakes or Raisin Bran or gas and whatever. And then you've got wage inflation. Wage inflation is ticking up. So wage inflation is ticking up. Not only that, with the moving on to the geopolitical crisis in the Middle East with the Red Sea and the Houthis attacking shipping, interesting to note that not yet, freight has gone up. The cost of a container has gone up from $2,000 now to $8,000. Not yet reflective in inflation. Not yet reflected in inflation. We'll be very clear. Okay. However, if that territorial dispute or conflict escalates and goes on for longer, Peter, what we're going to have is it will impact inflation because it's costing the ships more to circumvent African coast, the Peninsula of Africa, and around to the delivery. So the cost of the supply chain is going to be frustrated, and you're going to have rising costs of freight, which is going to be fed into the consumer. So we're going to see, if the war continues in the Middle East, especially with the Houthis, then we're going to see inflation rising. By the way, the US no US shipping uses the Red Sea as a conduit. China and Europe do, but the US have sent the Fifth Fleet there to fight the Houthis. Well, why is the US, why aren't China sending the fleets there? Why aren't Europe sending the fleets? Why is the US having to spend billions fighting the Houthis? Why is no one else coming to help?
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wired for Impact. If you're interested in creating and expanding your impact, be sure to visit us online at impactnow.com.